I'm Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner, but I live in Colorado. I'm a historian, I'm an outdoorsman, and I'm a movie buff. I hunt and I fish, I kayak and I climb mountains. I like to explore old places and ask new questions. I'm curious about the world. And this is a reckoning. Rachel, I am so excited to talk to you today. Welcome to Colorado.
Thank you. Home of some of the murders in my first book, The Man on a Train. Yeah,
well, that's the very first time someone's ever welcomed themselves with saying, "Hi, I know where you live, and people have been murdered there." I lived, however, you're in Kansas, right?
Yes, Lawrence, Kansas.
All right, a town that I actually dearly love. I lived for 5 years in Wichita.
Oh yeah,
home of the BTK killer.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
I don't think he used axes, though.
No, I don't think so. No, he was bind, torture, kill. So he was more about, I don't know what he used to actually kill. I know he was into tying people up, but I think it was a knife or something like that.
What's his name? Dennis Rader, I think his name was. Is that called? That sounds right? So I have to tell you about my love of Lawrence before we get into this.
Absolutely.
I think Lawrence is like the coolest town. I think that whole area. Lawrence is really cool. Kansas City, I really like a lot for a lot of different reasons. But Lawrence, I always felt like when I lived in Kansas, I would go to Lawrence. I'd always go to like Free State Brewing, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Mass Street Lawrence always felt like a ski town without a mountain to me. That's what it always felt like to me.
We do have the hill. It is a pretty big hill, but we've never used it for skiing or anything like that.
Hill of Kansas.
Myriad, yes. Yeah, where KU where I work.
That's a gorgeous campus, too.
It is. It's a beautiful campus. My dog's joining us back here.
I see your dog. No, how dare you? We are pro dog and cat, guinea pig, whatever that you've got spouses, whatever you've got rolling back there. It's all fine and good. All right, you came on. We're here to talk about this book.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes,
are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Oh, we're both having. Do you have the advanced reader copy, or do you have the finished product?
I have the advanced reader copy right here. I'm keeping my copies. Let me get one. Actually, I'm gonna put my camera up just if that's okay. Because I would love to show it off. It's such a beautiful
please
book.
Do so. It is.
There we go. I like that a little bit better. Yes. No, it's got the nice. Oh, and here's a train coming by. Gonna get that on your recording.
Oh, please.
I live
right
by the train track, like way close to the train tracks. It's a little creepy given my first book.
Oh, see, that even works really well for everything that you've got going on with your first book. Like, trains are good.
A little bit of atmosphere.
Can I tell you, I still believe in the romanticism of trains and like the American West and all of that.
Oh my God. And I'm not an airplane person, especially lately. I cannot
not so much.
deal with airplanes at all. No, It's not. Never been comfortable, and they're just making it more uncomfortable, and now they're crashing into each other. The safety was the thing that it had going for it, and the speed, obviously, but
with the history of the train in like the creation of the United States, I'm always shocked at the pushback against like modernizing our rail system in the United States, because you think this is a no-brainer.
I know.
Just because every other country has it and it's better than ours, let's not do it. I mean,
and what you were saying about like expansion west, a lot of problems with that, of course, but that's how we were able to build a country that was so strong across the nation, was having these trains. And then we replaced it with cars, and a lot of great things about cars, but more dangerous. They're more costly. I love a train. You can kick back, watch the world go by, see people's weird backyards, see my weird backyard. And just enjoy yourself. Actually have some leg room. Yeah, I would love to take the train more often.
I want to do the Alaska train.
What's that?
I want to do the Alaska. Oh yeah, the Alaska train, where you just go up there and it's everything's like, pardon me, you up there and everything is salmon. But we are not here to talk about trains. That's your next book. We're here to talk about this one. Whack Job. Yes.
I want to show you a little bit of. See, it's got the nice shiny inset, and then there's the. Oh, this is a messed up one, but there's
the many axes.
All the axes which I drew in collaboration with a St. Martin's illustrator.
Love it.
I was so happy about the end papers. End papers are so cool, and it really makes a book feel special. So I was really excited that I got to do this. So yeah, that's been really a fun part of the process for sure. It's a beautiful book. St. Martin's did a great job on it.
Yeah,
I'm
they
really
really
happy.
did. I really love those guys over there.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this before we jump in here. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us like who you are and like what you're doing here?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to bring out my first book. So
Go for
sorry
it.
for the unstable camera. Hi, my name is Rachel McCarthy James. I'm a writer in Lawrence, Kansas. My first book, The Man from the Train, was about the serial killer behind the Valeska axe murders, as well as about 100 or so other axe murders. It's why this book is very thick. My next book, Whack Job, kind of digs into why the axe murder became such a staple of pop culture and true crime, going all the way back to our earliest axes, flint hand axes, Egyptian battle axes, Chinese battle axes, the labrys in ancient Greece, fasces, Viking axes, and Henry VIII up until, tomahawks and carpenter's hatchets and all of the things that they have done to build America and to create destruction in their wake.
Yeah, this is, I have to tell you, this is such a cool book. When I picked it up and started reading, it's like, I just kept going.
Yeah,
it's
it's a fun read, I think. Yeah.
It is. It really is. And I was telling some friends about it last night because I was like, it's this journey through time through through different kinds of axes and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And it really,
Exactly
and there were chapters here that I wasn't expecting, like the chapter in Henry VIII. I have a particular fascination with, telling the story of early America, obviously. So when we get to Fort Necessity here in a bit, that'll be fun to talk about. And it's kind of weird because the axe actually, it's so weird. When I first became aware of your book, the first thing I thought was like, well, so I married an axe murderer, right?
Right.
Was
absolutely, yeah. That's why we still use that joke. That's what made it stick in a lot of ways, even though it's also about The Shining. But so I married an axe murderer. That really, it's funny. It's a cult movie. It wasn't a popular movie at the time, as I'm sure you know. But the stickiness of that phrase and the joke in and of itself of the title just works on its own, and that's really made it. Brought it from, a 1920s newspaper staple to a common pop culture reference today.
Well, it's weird because axe murder itself has almost become like this humorous, like throwaway line in our vocabulary. Back when I used to date, I would like, you would talk to somebody online and so like, here, let me give you, this is my name. So, I'm an axe murderer or whatever. I'm like, or whatever. It's like, haha, no, I'm a safe guy, but here's this really horrible thing to contrast it with,
Yeah, it's kind of a safe way to invoke a lack of safety. Because, the axe, what I found through researching this is that usually the axe is not picked up like intentionally as a fetish object like it was with the Man from the Train. It's picked up out of convenience. And it's not convenient. You don't have an axe around everywhere anymore. It's not something that you can pick up easily because it's in the kitchen or because, you're working outside. So it's kind of remote. It's kind of obsolete. But at the same time, it's still so familiar and so entwined with our daily life that I think that it becomes both kind of remote, but also still having a little bit of a threat there. So you can be a little taboo and make a little bit of an edgy joke without going too far.
Yeah. And there's so much now as I started to think about your book and conceptualizing, and I was kind of watching around social media. We can talk about this towards the end about how I'm seeing the axe kind of pop up in these different places that maybe we never really expected it. So
you take it for granted, and then you start to realize how much of a part of the fabric of society it really is, that how much it cannot, even as we've got all of these devices, even as we've put off so many of the original uses of the axes onto other parts of our industry, it's still so part of the fabric of our culture and our community that it's never going to fully go away. I think it'll outlast smartphones and
unless we're talking about, was it the old Nokia smartphone? Remember? Or no, that wasn't a smartphone, but you remember the thing from like 2000.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Those things will be here forever.
Well, you'll have to write a book about like killing people with Nokias at some point in time, just people dropping them from high.
They were basically a brick, so there's that to it.
Well, should start, Rachel, with the beginning. Let's not overassume, because as this book goes along, an axe changes over time. Not only the physicality, but its meaning and its use and stuff like that. So let's go back. For those of you who have never been outside or seen a tree, Rachel and I are now going to explain to you what an axe is. So let's go all the way back. Your book starts way back.
way back.
You want to talk about what an axe is and like how it comes to be created?
Absolutely. So the first axes were stone hand axes, and those were really as much hammers, planers, daggers, knives as they were axes. It was kind of a stem cell for a lot of different transformative technology. And the oldest hand axes, which were made with a piece of flint, usually pretty big, usually about this big, about 6 inches, which was made by throwing it against other rocks, basically, in a kind of percussive pattern, trying to nap it off, trying to get shards off so it would get sharp on both sides and come to a point. So that was used for a lot of things. It was used for like stripping bark, stripping animal skins, and also breaking down wood, chopping wood. So it was very old technology. My first murder is about 450,000 years ago. And by that point, the axe was actually already kind of old technology. There was a lot of newer technology like fire, or arrows, or like clubs and things like that. They were beginning to get the hang of handles. So the axe was it was something that with a flint hand axe it was around everywhere. Almost everyone had one. There was always one available. So when these two, not quite Homo sapiens, not quite Neanderthals, early humans got into some kind of conflict, the axe or a club or some other big sharp rock would have been right at hand to use against each other. And so the scientific team in Spain went down to La Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, and they found all of these old skulls, and they reconstructed this one skull, cranium 17, and found 2 identical impacts on the skull way back here, above what I start talking about is the hat brim line, the hut creme. Let me look at it again.
Yeah. Hutkrempenregel.
I like your pronunciation. I like that a lot.
German's fun.
Yeah, it
German's
is.
a lot of fun to say. So much English.
It is. Right. So it was found beyond a marker of the hat brim line, which is basically, imagine a hat.
Okay.
The parts that are covered by a hat, probably not going to get killed, not going to get hurt in an accident. When you're hurt in an accident, you're generally falling forward, hurting your face, or sometimes the very back of your head. But if it's up here, that's a lot more likely to be an intentional interpersonal lethal violence is what they call it in the paper, a murder, basically. So this person had 2 identical fractures to their skull in that area. And, the same tree branch cannot fall on you the same way twice. So there's no way it could be an accident somehow. 2 identical markers that's coming from one thing, that's coming from one impact done twice to really make sure that it got through.
Yeah, somebody back in the day was really pissed off at Bill, or I guess this is in Spain, so Guillermo. I actually brought something. Today's my show and tell. I never get to do this. I have for you a hand axe. This comes from not from Europe, but this is from Western Kentucky, where I'm from originally. I don't know how my family came into possession of this. I know that we've had this for like decades and decades, but I've got a little hand axe here. I thought it was kind of fun to hold
so
now.
Well,
it feels like more like a scraper. It's got some heft to it.
That does look. I can see it planing something. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
And of course it's probably worn down from its original usage, right?
But I still see the blade there that could be used to cut something for sure.
Yeah, totally, right? Especially like if you were like, you had like a piece of like, what Dan Flores would refer to as charismatic megafauna, right? If you had a large piece of meat, you really kind of need this big hefty stone to kind of pull that down or cut it, because if you're cutting into, golly, I don't know what would be in Western Kentucky at this point in time, any number of ungulates or whatever, you really need something to kind of get in there and kind of push this around.
Something with some force for sure.
Yeah, right. So cranium 17, we find this. Do we know if it was a man or a woman? Were they able to figure this out?
No, don't know anything about it. They think it was at least 20 years old, but that's about all that they know. No markings as gender. It was healthy before that. Part of the mystery is that all these skulls and bones were found at the bottom of a cave, and there's no other human activity. There's no like fire or anything down there. We're talking about ungulates. There's no ungulates bones, and So no one was climbing in and out or anything like that. But there was this one beautiful hand axe, which the researchers call Excalibur. It's this gorgeous, it's my desktop background. It's so beautiful. It's this gorgeous, like red and orange and ochre thing. And it comes to a really fine point, really beautiful, lots of swirls. And it's a really lovely object. And the researchers think maybe, it's a mourning object. Maybe it was thrown in there kind of to mark the mourning, to mark the grieving process. So it's kind of showing how axes could be, it's possible that it ended up in there accidentally. Someone had one in their loincloth or whatever, and they were thrown in there and they didn't realize that there was this axe in there that could have been used. But I mean, it's kind of the mystery of these things. One thing I like about this book is, my last book was pretty much a mystery, following a mystery. Most of these stories, Lizzie Borden's a little bit of a mystery still, but in most of these cases, we don't know. We know pretty much who did what, when, and why. But Cranium 17 is really an essential mystery. It gets deeper by the day because they've been reconstructing more of these skulls, the research team, and they found a lot more skulls that also have these evidence of lethal interpersonal violence. So it's not just this one incident, it's a lot of different incidents.
The first thing I'm thinking about whenever I think about this, but pulling my very limited, I was an anthro minor, back in college and did a lot of anthro work in graduate school as well, because, my background's in indigenous history. Yeah. And first thing I'm thinking about is like, are these like, is the dispatching of Cranium 17, is this like ritualistic? Is this a ceremonial thing with the two, and I'm wondering like these other spots, like were these other deaths at the same time? Were they able to figure out like all of these things happened?
I don't think they were able to figure out that for sure. But there's definitely, I would say it's definitely evidence of some kind of ritual, whether that's a mourning ritual where it's something where you're going to mark deaths that are especially tragic, or if it's perhaps some sort of ancient ritual. Humans are extremely ritualistic. We still do a lot of human sacrifice rituals. I talk about that in the Chinese chapter. The expert I spoke to about that pointed out how there are, not just things like capital punishment, but things like mass layoffs. There's a lot of human loss there in service to a greater corporate goal, basically. And that's a kind of human sacrifice ritual as well. Or another more relatable example is triage, where you have to, figure out what order you're going to tend to these people in and kind of make a ritual of how to manage a crisis situation. So, rituals are so deeply human, so much a part of us. And they're really one of the through lines in this book is the axe and human ritual. So I could definitely see it being a part of a ritual observance for sure.
Yeah, and I really want to get into these ideas of these executions as ritualistic events later on as well, because like I said, we listen, Henry VIII killed everybody. I feel like this will be a fun chapter to talk about. But before we start moving on, I want to ask you: at some point in time, we go from this piece of stone that I have here in my hand, this hand axe, if you will, to a handled axe.
Yeah.
How does that happen, Rachel? Have we figured out like when that technology starts to occur, or what happens as a result of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do know. Actually, it was right around the time of this first axe murder that I talked about. There is some evidence of ancient glue. Actually, that was really surprising to me because a lot of earliest handled axes are like lashed on. Yeah. They're added with twine or wool or whatever it is. But some of the earliest were actually like stuck in there and then there was glue added to it. That was at the very, very early stages because there was a lot of, they knew a lot about adhesives. Think about how much stuff is sticky in the natural world and they used that to their advantage. But I think that, one of the things with axes, one of the dangers of axes when you're not using it to kill is that the head can fly off. That becomes an issue at several different points. And I think that those early axes that were used with this glue, you could get them in there and you do them with one job or two, but then, and it's a lot of, adding a handle to an axe adds a lot of power. There's a lot of force you can do, when you're just got that one axe, you really have to work at it to get the necessary force. It's not just about how heavy the rock is, it's about how hard you can push it. But when you've got a handle, there's a lot more force that's available to you for much people with less strength. So a handle would have been a really big aid, especially with chopping down trees, I think. But I think that early on, it probably was not a super permanent solution. And so it was about 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, I believe, that handles became really popular, and you saw a lot of lashed handles. It's right around when metal was starting to become more popular too. So there was really an explosion in technology in a lot of ways.
I can only imagine that with the addition of the handle became that many more axe murderers.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's like, oh, I can get you now. I can really come at you.
Yeah.
Stay right there.
This will fly off Bobby in the head instead.
Right, the axe itself does not become a projectile as you're breaking it down. I'm wondering, before we get more into the book, when you were writing this book, did you get to play around with a bunch of axes? Like, did you go out and chop at stuff?
I have got axe throwing a few times, and I do have an axe that I'm not very good at it. I'm not a very good woodswoman.
It's an art.
It is an art, and I respect it. And also, when you're talking about violence, it's good to keep a little bit of distance between you and the topic. And also, my dad is a baseball legend, and he is terrible at baseball, so I figure there's a familial precedent for it. So yeah, I do have a nice little collection of axes, and I do go out and use them in the garden sometimes, probably unnecessarily, just because I want to get some hatchet time in. But yeah, it is fun. They're beautiful objects. I really love to collect them a little bit now, but it's more about display and understanding and having a new shiny thing than actually using it, to be honest.
There was this really cool store when I was going to graduate school in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota. They had there was this really cool store there. I always loved the name of it, called Midwest Mountaineering, which I always giggled at because it's the idea, right? But you would go in there and they'd have all the stuff, the outdoorsy stuff and things like that. But then they would have like all of these insanely gorgeous, like Swedish axes that were like $300. And of course, I was graduate, so like $300. That's food for the next 7 months.
Yeah.
But
beautiful.
It was so cool. I want to move on to a new place in time.
Absolutely.
Over my right shoulder, you'll see my entire Egypt section because I have like 3 of my besties are all Egyptologists. Yeah, they're like that's my friend Kate Shepard's book over there. She's amazing. As are Julia Trochet and Leah Packard Grants, because now if I don't say the other 2 names, I'm going to get in trouble in the chat group. I'm the guy on the women's chat group. It has been mind blowing, Rachel. But can we talk about Egypt? Because the axe shows up in some really unexpected places in this Egyptian chapter.
Yeah, it was really fun getting into that chapter and figuring out, because there's so much attention on Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and Second Enray's story comes in right before the New Kingdom. One of his sons basically started the New Kingdom. So it's this really interesting little slice of history, the Hyksos people, who are so mysterious in so many ways. They kind of popped up at the end of the Middle Kingdom when there was a ton of discord. There was a gerontocracy. There was too tight border security, which was kind of starting to unravel. It was a real time of chaos. There was like one pharaoh after another for a long time, so there was no stability. And the second Enray was the king of Thebes, which is down kind of what we think of as south of the Nile Delta, what they thought of as north of the Nile Delta because of the way it flows. And they were kind of, holding it together. Thebes was really holding it together, trying to preserve the old Egyptian identity, whereas the Hyksos were trying to basically move on with it and create a new society that actually functioned. So it's all about Second Enray going and kind of breaking with these traditions of how a pharaoh acts and how a pharaoh might tend to stay in his palace rather than go out and fight. And he goes out on the battlefield very bravely, but then he's killed for it. He's captured and killed on the battlefield by the Hyksos, who used a couple of different kinds of axes on him. Probably a few different other things as well, daggers and maces, but first axes, I think.
are the Egyptians really the first people to kind of start really using the axe in warfare, or has this kind of happened beforehand?
I would say that the battle axe was pretty well established by that point. They had a different kind of battle axe before the Hyksos came
Mm-hmm.
along. They had a more crescent axe, so more like a C shape, which was used for both wood cutting and for battle axes. And the Hyksos brought in more of this, I think it was like a flared gene leg, kind of thin, looks more like our axes, like an axe you might see in a store today. So they'd really just come up with this. They'd recently advanced in terms of axe technology, but they definitely weren't the first to use battle axes. I would say that battle axes have a pretty long history before that. It's just that we don't have that great of a knowledge of it because a lot of history kind of starts with Egypt and yeah.
When we talk about the Hyksos, are we talking and with these battle axes? Are we talking about these great big two-handed kind of things? Or are we talking about like a single hand you might like with kind of like with a shield? Like how would they use these things?
I would say that it would be two-handed. These were pretty big axes, especially the ones that had the longer blade.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just go ahead and bring up my illustration of
Please.
The ceremonial. This is an axe in Second Enray's wife, Ahotep. So you see how big the...
Oh, yeah, that's significant.
It's a ceremonial, so it wouldn't have been in use. It was gold, so that's too soft to really use.
Right.
But it was a lot. They were more like a square or more like a circle, half circle right here before that. So you see how that has a lot more reach. There's another hook to do more damage.
Right.
So this is kind of the new axe technology that was coming along at this time of during Second Enray's life. And that's what ended up telling him. But then the Egyptians, one thing about the Egyptians is they're very good at taking someone else's technology and being like, this is ours, we rule at this now. Chariots, right around the same time, are another example. The Hyksos also introduced chariots to the Egyptians, and that was a huge, that's part of why Second Enray failed, but that was a huge step forward for Ahmos's kingdom and how he was able to finally wrest back control of Egypt from the Hyksos.
You know, one of the things I found really fascinating was the idea of the depiction of axes in Egyptian hieroglyphics and its association with like the enemy. Like, can you talk a little bit about that? Because we see the axe kind of appearing in like cultural presentations as well. And God bless the Egyptians for like giving us some some recordings. Right? They're like the Spanish before the Spanish.
Yeah, that shows up in ancient Chinese writing as well. The man with the axe was another word for king. And it shows up in Mayan. That's a little bit later, of course, but it shows up in Mayan hieroglyphs as well.
Crazy.
Axe is really synonymous with power. And I would think that in that time, an axe was definitely a instrument of like royal punishment, as it would be later. There were a lot of different kinds of royal punishment, capital punishment. But I would think that, the word for enemy being depicted with an axe is definitely a show of its brute force, and as well as I would also say it's about how widely axe technology had traveled by that point, that it was something that was common to every society, something that was common to, you could count on your enemy having an axe, whereas they might not have as great of arrows, or, their horse technology might be behind, but an axe spread pretty well wherever there were people. There's one early theory of human migration called the Mobius line. That talks about how you can kind of track whether there was human civilization at different points in early human civilizations by seeing where the axes were. And if there were axes in a certain place, you knew that this was somewhere we had gotten by a certain point. So I would say that was about how widely it had spread through Africa, especially, but also through, north of Africa and Europe and Asia as well. Just that it was that ubiquitous of technology.
One of the things I found fascinating about the book is, I'm kind of a guy, right? I'm a dude. And I tend to associate the axe with masculinity. In
Yeah,
American culture, we think about it as woodsmen,
absolutely.
maybe in warfare, things like that.
Yeah.
But there's this tremendous chapter in the book that really kind of puts this on its head. And of all places, it's coming from Viking history.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. So the axe is really I mean, that was surprising to me too, because it is so much an emblem of masculinity. But it's also an emblem of domesticity. It's not just a weapon of war, it's not just a weapon of violence. It's about building a homestead, keeping it warm, keeping the fires
Hmm.
warm, being able to butcher chickens and whatnot. Keeping the fires burning, repairing the house. So it's really a tool that was in domestic life. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, he takes an axe from the kitchen.
Hmm.
It wasn't something that he grabbed from like a soldier or something like that. It was just something that was in the home, ready to be used, ready to be picked up. So I think that that's a big part of what that's about. The axe was really what's interesting about the Viking culture is that the axe was. Sorry, let me start over. Sorry. So what's really interesting about Viking culture and what I found was really interesting in talking to Viking experts is that the sword was so much higher status than the axe.
Really?
The sword is a big symbol of honor, especially for Vikings, but really across cultures. The sword tends to be higher status than the axe, which is this common domestic labor implement. The sword is just about war. The sword is just about violence. It's a big investment in terms of materials. A sword, it's a big thing. That's a lot of metal that you have to keep sharp, which can be difficult. Whereas an axe head gets worn down, you sharpen the end, you stick on a new handle. It's nothing fancy, but it works. A sword is more of a feat of engineering. It really shows off all the resources you can put into it, all of the skill that you can put into it. And it's also, there's the phallic component as well. It's a big, kind of like a gun now. It's a really big symbol of masculinity in that very literal way. Whereas the axe, I think, it doesn't have quite, there is a bit of that as well with the big old handle and everything. But it's definitely, the labrys also, going back to Greek culture, that's a huge symbol of femininity. That's very much a feminine weapon, very much an icon of the Amazons is the labrys, the double-sided axe. So I think there's that as well. So I think the domesticity of the axe, and as well as its history with the labrys, really lends it a feminine flavor that I think is unexpected for a lot of people. And I think that's part of what was the appeal with the Lizzie Borden case. On the face, it's kind of shocking. On the face, it's, this Victorian, proper, upright woman who would never express any kind of discomfort suddenly kills two people out of nowhere. But I think it's also about getting back to it as a domestic implement, getting back to it as a weapon of common convenience, something that was just there that could be picked up in a minute. Whereas a sword, it's hanging on the wall.
Yeah, I really like the comparison between the sword and the gun in Viking culture,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder if the Vikings on the back of their fast ships were on their boats had like stickers saying with the sword saying "Come and take it" somewhere along the way, or maybe on the back of their horses.
Yeah.
You want to talk about Freya, Eric's daughter?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about some murder, Rachel.
Yeah. So Freydis
Yeah.
Freydis was the daughter of Eric the Red, sister of Leif Erikson.
Mm-hmm.
And Eric the Red came over and founded Greenland when he was kicked out of Iceland after killing a bunch of people. Excuse me. So Leif Erikson, his son, became a very, very prominent, famous explorer. He would often go on these profitable and honorable journeys where he would go to Canada and get, he would get furs, he would get meat, he would get trees, lumber. Greenland and Iceland both are heavily deforested. There's no real lumber supply around.
Wow.
In fact, a lot of Europe was really heavily just deforested, which is kind of what made the axe such an American icon, that we had these huge forests to clear. So anyway, Greenland was heavily deforested, and so you had to make these frequent trips to Canada to fell some big old redwoods and big trees and bring them back and process them into planks so you can make houses and build ships. The axe was huge for shipbuilding. One of the big purposes for axes is cutting wood and shaping it into planks. And with planks, they have to be really watertight. You really have to get them precisely. It's not like a home where you can plug it up and you can use other materials to keep the cold out. Keeping it as watertight as possible is really key. And so you have to have really sharp, really precise axes for that kind of thing. So you see a lot of new and different axe technology, a lot more beards, which is the thing on axes that I'll show you. Which is the thing that kind of dips down below that. So see this here. This is the
Yep.
See, this is the beard. So that makes it easier for like cutting into these big planks and planing them correctly. So Freydice is not. I had a couple of paragraphs that I eventually cut out about her being a girl boss. That's kind of fallen out of favor in the last couple of years. But that's definitely what it reminded me of. She really wanted a piece of the masculine pie for herself. She really wanted to be able to get the same honor and the same prestige and the same wealth that her brother did. So she is all told in the Norse Great Norse poetry chronicles. There's two stories of her, and one she uses a sword and one she uses an axe. And in the sword one, it's very much a story of her bravery and honor. She goes with some people to Canada and gets into a fight with the native people there, and all of the men in this skirmish flee. She walks out heavily pregnant, topless, and slaps a sword against her breasts and scares everyone away that way. And that's a story about her. That's an admirable story about her. Obviously the politics there are not great. But as to the Norse people, it was definitely about her bravery and also about, the contrast of the feminine and the masculine and how it could ultimately bring honor to the men around her. But, there's also the element of bare-breasted woman striking out for freedom. That's a really deep artistic motif. You see it in French Revolutionary art. You see it on the flag of Virginia, things like that. So it harkens back to a lot of different, neo-pagan Christian imagery. And anyway, the axe murder story is she pressures these two brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, to go on a trip with her to Canada. They've got these big ships, and she says, hey, let's work together. Let's bring all of our ships and really bring home, a big bounty. So they get there, and they think that they're going to be using Leif Erikson's homestead that he set up there. And they move in and they get here a little bit before her. And she comes in and she says, no, this is just for me. You've got to go set up camp somewhere else. So right away, the tone is off. And they go through the winter. They have a bunch of different competitions to keep themselves from going crazy out of boredom. Horse fighting, which seems like a terrible use of resources to me, as well as kind of these ancient diss tracks where you'd make up stories about your preferred leader and kind of diss the other person's leader. So eventually bad blood sprung up among them. And Freydice and her men and Helgi and Finnbogi and their men are kind of at odds. So one day, Freydice comes over to the brothers and she says, hey, if you just give me your ships, then there's not going to be any more discord. We're going to be fine after that. Just give me your ships. And they're like, okay, I can't do anything else. I clearly cannot reason with this woman. I'm scared of her. You can have my ships. But this still does not satisfy her. She goes to her husband and she says, I will divorce you for unmanliness if you do not. They have beaten me and they have said awful words to me, and you need to go and kill them to avenge my honor, basically. And, in Viking society, masculinity was very highly held. If you insulted someone's manhood, you were basically saying your reputation is ruined. So this was basically the ultimate, marital chess move that she could make. So they go and they kill all these men, but there are 5 women with them, 5 women that the brothers brought with them. And those the Viking men would not kill. So Freydis says, give me an axe. She goes and she kills all of them in pretty quick order. And they eventually head back to Greenland. And at first, they're very well received. All of their trees and the lumber and the furs that they bring back are very well received, very hot commodity. And everyone is wealthy for a little bit, and everyone keeps the story. But they notice when, it's a small society, it's like 1,000 people there maybe. And they notice when, the 60 men that Helgi and Finnbogi took with them do not return. And they're like, oh, they decided to stay there. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Just take these furs and go. But eventually word gets out. Can't keep a secret like that. And Leif Erikson finds out and basically says, your reputation is done. You cannot do anything else. No more of these profitable and honorable journeys for her. So it's really a morality tale about what happens if you get greedy, what happens if you get too violent, what happens if you break the rules of femininity as well.
Wow. I'm fascinated with the use of this axe. I had seen her, I think, in maybe the Viking show that was on recently. Is that correct?
Yeah, she's in the Viking show. Yeah, I have not seen that, but I know she is a character there. And, she's a really dynamic character. She brings out a lot of Eric the Red and highlights a lot of his traits. So, as someone who's a lot like my own father, I can really, I get it, but not to that level.
I wish we at the University of Minnesota, where I did grad school, there's a very well established Viking history.
Oh yeah,
there as well. Everyone up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, I think a lot of Scandinavian folks up there, so very strong traditions there. And I wish I had a chance.
I'm going to be doing an event in Minneapolis in a couple of weeks. Next week.
Have you been to Minneapolis before?
I have not since I was a little kid. So I'm really excited.
For you, I love Twin Cities. It's especially in the summertime. It is a magical place. You'll love it. You talk about Freydis doing all of these executions, and nobody loves a good execution like Henry VIII. And that is maybe the best segue I've ever done on this podcast. Can we talk about the axe as a piece of state power, and like how Henry VIII is using the axe, and like it's all of its incarnations in Tudor England?
Yes. So, I mean, the axe was a really well-established weapon for state power at this point. There was a long history of it. In China, there was, like I was talking about before, the king, one of the words for king, Wang, was the man with the axe. And the king in that chapter, Wu Jing, would hang a huge axe behind him as a way of showing, your life is on the line here if you're challenging me.
Note to self, buy axe.
Has to be a really big axe, though. Really big axe with some scary etching on it. That's the only way it works. And there's also, of course, Greece and Rome. The axe was a big implement of state power. It was kind of a common weapon held by lictors. It's a part of the fasces, which, of course, is where we get the word fascist.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see it on a lot of government imagery as well. It's a really old symbol of power. It's a bundle of rods carried by magistrates and lictors, and they would have an axe blade hanging out of it if they had the power to execute you that day. If there was no axe head hanging out of it, they could just beat you, but they wouldn't kill you, basically. So it had a lot of baggage going back. It had a lot of time-honored tradition. I think it was also associated with the power of the Vikings, which was mixed in with that as well. So in Henry VIII's in Tudor England, it had acquired a kind of dignity, being killed by an axe rather than being drawn and quartered or burned at the stake or hanged or any of the other awful ways to...
Cleaner.
It is cleaner. It is cleaner. It's instantaneous. If you've got a good executioner, one of the things that they really wanted was a good executioner. And obviously you have that on hand. If you're Henry VIII and you're executing tens of thousands of people over your reign, it's something like 60,000 people.
Are you kidding me?
No, it's crazy. It is
I
It
had
is
no
wild. There's
idea.
no exact figure, but it is as high as 50,000 is a number I've heard used quite a bit. So it's
Where he's personally
huge.
ordering the executions?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of them, yes, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of them he was very
We
much
know about the
personally.
wives, but
Yes. Yeah. And there's an interesting one there as well. Anne Boleyn, who, of course,
please.
was known for style and beauty. The last nice thing he did for her, basically, was upgrade her from a common axe to a fancy French sword. So kind of going out with style, as she always did. But usually the axe was, like I said, a dignified, time-honored, clean, classy, well ritualized part of the execution ritual. There was a whole method to follow. It wasn't something where you didn't know what was happening to you. You were so lost in the pain, you didn't know what was happening to you next. You could, keep your wits about you. You could avoid crying. That was very important for male condemned. And you would lay your head on the block, and then you would swing out your arms basically to indicate, go ahead and do it, I'm ready, to indicate consent. And you would have a chance to say your last words, to give some money to the executioner, because you don't personally blame the executioner. They're just an administrator, basically, and you want them to do a good job so that you'd have less pain. But in some cases, Margaret Pole.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. She was an older woman, very dignified, very royal, very wealthy woman who was very attached to Catholicism as well. And she was held in the Tower of London for a long time, years and years, and had less than 30 minutes from getting up one morning to being executed. And she was not able to, maintain her composure, because it was just, she didn't even know what she was charged with. There was no real trial. She was just woken up one morning and said, okay, you're going to this place. You didn't even have time to make her, the afterlife and God was such a real preoccupation to these, not preoccupation, was such a real thing to them. It was not something that we debate like we debate now. It was something where this is what happens after you die. This is how you get your soul ready for death. This is how you prepare for this thing that could happen to you any second, with not just execution, but the plague, a million other things, bad water, dysentery. There's so many things that could kill you. Death was always right around the corner, and you had to make sure that you were ready to go. So most of the people who were executed in that chapter, which would be two of King Henry the Seventh's taxmen, basically, who King Henry VIII executed to show that he was kind of different from them. And as well as Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, a lot of very high status people. And they usually would get a good bit of time to confess their sins, talk to the people around them, basically make themselves dignified and ready before they face the block. So there was a real, the ritualistic aspect of it really helped them out, really helped them process what was happening to them.
There was a guy, and I don't have his name here, who tells this great joke right to the executioner about his beard.
Yes, yeah. Let me make sure I'm not messing up my Thomases More and Cromwell. I should know this at this point, but you know how it is.
And while you're looking that up, I want to fill this in, because I want to say one of the best lines in this book I loved was what you're talking about in the idea of these executions, was this idea of the state power. You have this wonderful quote. It says, the axe tells anyone who hopes to resist that they will not only be killed, but be ideologically defeated. Love that line.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, the axe, I mean, it's a sharp instrument, but it's also a blunt instrument. It really holds the power of total obliteration, at least, especially before the gun came on the scene. Once the gun came on the scene, that always topped them in terms of total annihilation. But before that, the axe really held that power. The axe really held that power. The force of it was really powerful. And I think I think that's a big part of why it persists as I think it's a big part of why it persists as a symbol of violence, is that it's so deeply held. It goes back so far that it's hard to extricate that. And I think that tension is a little bit, because it's, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's obsolete. It's certainly very useful still, but it's not something that we would use on a daily basis. And I think that that tension there between its ability to obliterate and how much power we've seen it hold versus its current non-use, basically, is a real interesting tension and real sign of how quickly not just industrialization, but technology has leapt forward in the last 200 years. We've gone from using it all the time, every day, to almost never using it. Sure. And I think that there's something uncomfortable about that a little bit. And I think that that's part of what makes the axe murderer so appealing. It was Thomas More who said he asked the executioner to pardon his whiskers as they were innocent of any treason. And that's a good way to show your good humor. And it was, a lot of it was about still pleasing the king. This was not, most people who were executed in this way were not resisting because they were concerned for their family. They didn't want their family to bear the brunt of any misdeeds they committed while being executed. So it was a way to show kind of it, be like, yes, I admit to this. Please don't punish my family for what I am apologizing for here, as well as a way to show good humor and to show that you got still retaining your masculinity, basically, that you're not so bothered about it that you can't make a joke about your beard.
Well, at this point in time, these guys are really interested in like their own legacy at this point in time, right? This is the last thing that I'm going to do. I have to greet this axe with a certain level of courage and honor. Right, even though I may be a traitor or whatever, there's almost like a sense of like, okay, we're having this guy executed.
Yes.
Or we are executing. I don't want to be passive voice. We are executing this man. However, he greeted his death in a final act of nobility, I guess, might be the way.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, Henry VIII was so changeable. He changed his opinion. He was really, by the time Thomas More was dead, he was really starting to get pretty deep in his mania, and he often regretted killing these people after he'd killed them. He regretted having gotten rid of Thomas More. He regretted, having lost a lot of his supporters. And I think that could play out in a lot of different ways for the people he left behind.
Some bad buyer's remorse when you axe murder.
What's that?
Some bad buyer's remorse when you when you order the executions of people.
Especially at that scale.
Inside your book, and for people listening in here, we are by no means covering the entirety of the book. There's so much here we're leaving out so that you go off and read this book. But there's a terrific chapter, because I hadn't really conceptualized it or thought about it initially when I saw the book, about tomahawks.
Yes.
A version of an axe. And I thought maybe for those people who are interested, it's a story that when my undergraduate advisor at Wichita State, Robert Owens, used to tell the story of Half King, Tanachristen, and George Washington and Fort Necessity.
I love that you knew the story before.
Absolutely. I love this story. Are you kidding me? And they used to love the way that Robert would teach it, because I stole his exact ways he would do it. The American Revolution, the 7 Years' War. Yeah. And later, and by extension, the American Revolution, and by extension, the United States of America owes its birth to the swing of an axe by this man. You want to tell the story of Tanachristen and Fort Necessity?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say right at the outset is that this is in 1750s. Everything was not determined yet. The fate was not set. Native people still held a lot of power. They had not been fully decimated yet the way that they would be by illness. There was certainly an element to it, but it wasn't quite as pervasive as it was later on. They were outnumbered, but they were very knowledgeable about the land on which they lived, which the French and English colonialists did not have that at all. They didn't know how to work with the land. They didn't know how to work with fire. They didn't know how to work with the forest. They just knew how to cut it down and start planting stuff. So Tonnacresson was what was called a half king, le demi-roi, to use the French. He was a representative of let me make sure I'm getting this right. He was the Five Nations, the Iroquois. So Tonnacresson was a Seneca official from the Iroquois Five Nations, who was basically he was a half king, which was semi-honorable term and semi-derisive term, because he held the power of being able to negotiate and give gifts and do a lot of diplomacy, but he couldn't make absolute statements. Like, he couldn't tell his own people where to go. He couldn't give orders, basically, but he was able to negotiate on the behalf of the Iroquois and be able to kind of lead situations as they developed. So he was basically, Native nations were definitely like playing the French and the English off each other. And Tonnacresson was more against French incursion onto his lands. So he was siding with the English basically as a way to play against them. And George Washington, who was 22 years old, had no idea what he was doing. Very confident young man who had already had founded a surveying company successfully, already rich. There weren't a lot of people who were eligible to lead troops like this. So he was kind of plucked from nowhere and asked to do this huge task. So he was paired with Tonnacresson to kind of track the French, see what they were doing, try and figure out some kind of negotiation, figure out a way to peacefully work the land together. So Tonnacresson comes with him to track the French. And there's weather, it's bad planning, it goes terribly. Until finally, in May, they find him in this Pennsylvania glen. Beautiful place, it's still there. Jumonville. I think it's Fort Jumonville now. Mm-hmm. It's a national park site. Pardon me. So they track them down. So Tonnacresson tracks them down to this one glen one morning, and they sneak up on them, and then there's a huge gunfire, but nobody's actually killed. And they stop to start negotiating, start discussing. Tonnacresson comes up to Jumonville, says in French, "You are not dead yet, my father," and then attacks him with a tomahawk. And reportedly after that, he puts his hands in Jumonville's brains and wipes his. Yeah, it's a very bloody story. And after this, Tonnacresson and George Washington separate, and George Washington leads them to this terrible little fort. He's Fort Necessity, that's what it's called. Mm-hmm. Fort Necessity, which is this just awful, terrible fort, not well built at all. And he and his troops are basically preparing to die. They are getting drunk because they're like, we're screwed here.
It's our ass.
Yeah, which makes sense. And so eventually the French come and they present him with this surrender treaty. And he can't read it. He doesn't speak French. He doesn't have anyone around who speaks French very well. And in that document, he admits to taking responsibility for Jumonville's death. And that eventually sets off the course of the 7 Years' War. And if you're thinking, why did George Washington go on to continue to have a career after this? It's because he wrote his memoirs. He published his travel journals, and they became very, very successful and kind of built his reputation until he became a much better general later in life. And I think it's interesting also, he's so stymied by the weather here. And then he's able to use it, 25 years later in the American Revolution to much greater effect.
Yeah, he's Washington, of course, is a source of no shortage of books. My great friend Craig
Yes.
Smith is writing some stuff. Washington is the favorite president of my 17-year-old. And the nights around the Herbert table.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well,
yeah, he's really. Go ahead.
Well, they're usually filled with fights over the best president between my boys. So it's always a Washington versus Lincoln thing.
Yeah.
But talk about the tomahawk here. There's also an
Yes.
aspect here. You dive into this a little bit about the idea of its really perversion over
Yeah.
time. The tomahawk itself is not just a
Yeah.
weapon of war. We see peace pipes
No.
in the form of tomahawks and things like that.
Absolutely.
Um,
Term bury the hatchet that comes from the native practice of burying a club or a hatchet after a conflict to kind of resolve good feelings and resolve peace.
you want to talk about like the sports stuff that you've seen as well, like when we see the Braves or at the Florida State games or
Yeah,
whatever.
that's really interesting. I wish I'd gotten into it. I mean, you kind of have to keep your eye on the prize with something as wide ranging as the axe and kind of keep it focused
Sure.
on violence. Definitely the racial violence of the tomahawk chop and all of that. So the tomahawk is interesting. Tomahawk dates back to stone axes before colonialization. The axe became so the axe was not actually used that much by the normal English people at the time that we started coming over here. London and Liverpool and any other city were pretty well developed. So you would kind of like now, someone else chopped your wood, someone else butchered your chicken, someone else shingled your roof. You might not have an axe if you lived in London in, 1620. So, and then they came over here and they had forests chopped down. They had land to clear, they had buildings to build, they had fires to build, and they didn't know how to do it. So suddenly the axe became a lot more valuable as a tool to people who were clearing the land over here, chopping down these great forests. And they also became an important trading tool with the native people. It was very highly valued to have metal. They didn't have metal before. So it became and they were able to, once they got a hold of metal, they were very great at working with it. They were able to reshape it and make it into this smaller hatchet rather than something huge, making it smaller, good for throwing, good for horseback, good for a lot of different things, also as a war weapon, but also as a tool for processing wood and other things. So the tomahawk is really interesting. Often a tool of diplomacy. You'll often see in portraits of native leaders or even colonial leaders, you'll sometimes see a tomahawk as a sign of good relations with native people. So it was a really interesting. So it's not the tomahawk chop is really, it's disturbing to see it used like that because it really is not used with honor. It's not used to. It's not. You have to go back to. Sorry, let me compose my thoughts on this. I mean, it's not like a sword or a saber because it's always portrayed as like a primitive weapon. It's always portrayed as a lashed rock on a stick, as with the Braves. Rather than something sophisticated, which is what it was, often an instrument of peace. You mentioned peace pipes; it's rarely part of it. But I mean, the real disgrace is about the characterization of native people in this way, using them as mascots in the first place, using something that is highly honorable and which has been mistreated throughout the American. Throughout the United States history, natives of people have been, it's a huge topic, and I can't do it justice in just a few minutes. Just how oppressed they've been, the genocide, making them into caricatures and mascots is just really, tomahawks are just one aspect of it. Tomahawks are just one aspect of dehumanization and characterization of these people and these nations. And I think that's really a disgrace. I wish I wish I were a little bit more articulate on this topic.
No,
But
it's very much when these sports fans in Kansas
yeah,
City, right, nearby you, or in Tallahassee or in Atlanta, are
yeah,
doing the tomahawk chop. I mean, they're very much tapping into this imagined savagery as a way to
yeah,
impart what they perceive to be savageness on the part of Native
absolutely,
people onto like their team, right, and participating in this.
absolutely,
And there's a great irony here, which is
yeah,
you find the tomahawk chop at Florida State football games. I went to Florida State as an
yeah,
undergrad, big Florida State Seminole fan, and I worked for the Seminole tribe of Florida. And I had elders tell me,
yeah,
he's like, we use the tomahawk not in that fashion. Tomahawk was purely ceremonial as a way to like actually divert hurricanes. You would plant the
yeah,
tomahawk into a tree as a way of like diverting a storm. It was a way of protecting, not as a way of of killing. Certainly it could be used in battle,
absolutely,
but rarely. So it's almost like it couldn't be further from the truth. This tomahawk actually, when
yeah,
you look at peace negotiations, or in the case of
absolutely.
like hurricanes,
Wampum belt.
yeah, it's quite
Uh,
literally a peace tool in so
it
many
is.
facets.
It
So
absolutely is. And I mean, that really gets to what the axe is. It's a tool of community. It's a tool of building civilization. It's a tool of building
right,
connections. I think that the wampum belts, they had wampum belts that they would trade as a way of negotiating and writing down these agreements. And it was a way to declare war. It definitely was a way to declare enmity, but it was also a way to declare peace. And I think that making it into a caricature in a way of reducing it to just something of warfare is really shameful. And I also wonder, why can't you just be the battle axes if you really want to trade on the tradition of the axe as a weapon? There's a lot of ways to do that aren't so dehumanizing. You could use the battle axes, you could use the halberds or something like that. Halberds are big pole axes that were sometimes carried in Europe. There's a lot of different ways that you could do that. It's funny that I don't see the Vikings using axes at all. The Minnesota Vikings, maybe they do. I'm not
no,
that.
and it's funny, Rachel, because when you said battle axe, you know what the first thing that popped to my mind was the
What was
term
that?
mother-in-law. Because like
Oh yeah,
you would often
interesting.
hear, right, like that old battle axe and blah blah blah, right? So,
It's interesting. I looked into that a little bit. I wasn't able to fit it in to the book, but I did look into that. And it was actually a gender neutral term for a long time. It was just a term for an older person who had a lot of things to say about the state of the world. But then around the time of Carrie Nation, I think. Carrie Nation, speaking of Wichita, there's a great
yeah,
Carrie Nation statue. I was just wandering around Wichita. There's some great
Wichita's
axe
a
stuff.
great town, right?
Wichita is a really fun town.
I
You've got the
really
keeper.
like Wichita.
Speaking of, using the tomahawk in an honorable way, the Keeper of the Plains statue in
Thank you.
Wichita,
Yeah,
that's a great one.
beautiful,
Love that one. Beautiful
beautiful.
act. It's a symbol of power, but it's not a symbol of bloodshed. It's a symbol of community,
Hmm.
and I really love that. But you've also got a Carrie Nation was also started in Wichita. There's a great little. I just was wandering around Wichita one night after a concert, and I just came across Carrie Nation holding this tiny little axe in her big hoop skirts. But anyway, Carrie Nation. So Carrie Nation was an abolitionist, anti-temperance protester, anti-alcohol, who would go into these bars and smash them up with rocks or little hatchets. And she used a hatchet as her kind of her emblem, as her personal, like she made
Hmm.
little pins of it and things like that. It was her personal branding. And so that became kind of her emblem. And I think that's where, when battle axe, that term became feminized. It was right around that time when that became a term for an older woman who had a lot of opinions.
This is a fun book to read. There are a lot of fun stories, like we are talking about, like the executions and things like that. And then I get to the story of Linda Gluckloff,
Yeah, Linda Lewis
and
Gluckman.
boy, does this book take a turn when we really get into the murders of murderdom
Yeah,
in your book. You want to talk about
right.
this, because this sheds a lot. I was thinking about this whole horrible story
Yeah.
as part of this way to illustrate norms around sexual violence and all of these things. You want to talk about about this little girl? What happens?
Yeah. So Linda Joyce Glukoft was a little girl in Los Angeles. She lived in a small tightly knit Jewish neighborhood. Pretty normal kid. She had, I want to back up for a second. You're talking about sexual norms. Talk about how we dealt with pedophiles and sexual predators, especially child sexual predation, which was basically to blame the little girl, call her a liar, call her fast. A child predator would get a misdemeanor, maybe. Like that was a harsh punishment for that crime at the time. Basically, people did not believe little girls. And part of the crazy thing with Linda Joyce Glukoft is she had already been molested by the man who killed her. She had already been kidnapped and molested at a earlier age when she was 3. So it was kind of like a lot of these horrible stories. Yeah. Horrible stories brought to life. But what was interesting is that, her mom was really following. So I'll tell you the story and hopefully you can fix this in editing. So Linda went over to her friend Rachelle's house. She thought Rachelle was there, but Rachelle was at a birthday party, and her grandfather, Fred Strobel, was the only one there. Fred Strobel, who had already molested Linda before at some point, said, "Hey, do you want some candy? I'll give you some candy." And she says, "Sure, I'll take some candy." And so she had been told by her mother that if it happened again, she should just refuse, resist, leave. And when she started to resist, Fred Strobel became enraged, basically, because norms were starting to change on this point. People were starting to take the idea that little girls were not lying about this, that they were not just being fast, that this was a real problem. So he had been molesting children for a long time at this point. He had been caught several times. He was already out on a misdemeanor. So I think he felt the walls closing in on him a little bit and decided, I can't let this get out. I've got to kill this girl, which is what he did. First, he, I believe, strangled her. Then he used a knife. Then he used an axe, a light axe, a boy's axe. And then he used an ice pick. So really, really brutal, really awful death. And then he just left the house and started wandering, and nobody could find him or Linda for about 12 hours. The reporters were on the scene. It's crazy to the extent to which we let reporters on the scene. They were in that whole house. They were taking photographs while the mother was being informed of her daughter's death. And it led to a huge manhunt looking for this man. And so it took, I think he was found after about 24 hours, but it really dominated the papers, and it made a big, and it became quite a big thing. It was heavily followed, heavily covered, and his, trial was heavily covered. And there was a lot of discussion of, should we be more understanding to these people? Should we, the guy, he says he really loved her, and I think he really did. Things like that. Still a lot of softening rhetoric towards pedophiles. But he also became a flashpoint for people who wanted to actually do something about this. But unfortunately, this was taken not just as let's start punishing these dirty old men, but this is actually about homosexuality. They said this is really about repressed homosexuality. We've got to punish the gays more for this, which led to some unfortunate legislation that has since been repealed, actually because of Linda's sister campaigned for it to be revealed about 10, 15 years ago. So it's really a horrible story, captures the cultural mores of the time in a really stark way. And this is where let me look up the name real quick. This story led a man by the name of so it led to several social guidance films by a man named Sid Davis, who was working with funding from John Wayne. This is where he was making social guidance films that gave basically children short narrative, cheesy films that show them how to behave, how to avoid predators. Don't get into a car with a stranger, that kind of thing. And it really, The Dangerous Stranger, which was released in 1949 and funded with help from John Wayne, it directly cites Strobel. It starts with actually a picture, a newspaper showing Strobel and talking about the manhunt, and talking about how this is the kind of thing we need to teach our children to avoid. So the fact that Strobel offered Linda candy made it into the film, but in that film, it's a stranger with candy. So that's where we actually get the trope strangers with candy. And it's really interesting because, I think one of the things we know now much better than we knew in 1950 is that if someone is going to prey on a child, it's probably going to be someone known to them rather than a stranger, which is the case with Fred Strobel and Linda Joyce Gluckhoff. She knew him. He was a part of her community. She thought she was safe in her friend's house. And so it's really interesting how we kind of try and push that responsibility back. And I think that's true of a lot of true crime too. True crime too. We really focus on stranger danger and not being in league with strangers, not exposing ourselves to strangers, when really the people who are most likely to murder us are the people who are in our lives already, the people we already trust. So I think there's kind of an interesting echo there with how we treat strangers versus how we treat the people who are actually likely to prey on us. And it's also interesting because it's starting to show this fabric that's starting to come apart because, yeah, it's true that you're more likely to be killed by someone known to you than someone unknown to you, but you also can't alienate yourself from your community just based on that. There's always going to be a danger. You can protect yourself from an axe, but there might be a gun in the safe. You never know what is going to happen. It's part of the danger of living together. Part of the joy of living together is this danger that's inherent in, having conflict with other humans, having lives that come into conflict with what other people want. Hope that made sense and I didn't ramble too much.
No. And this whole time, Rachel, we've been talking about these horrible uses of the axe, whether it's for murder or state power, ritual, things like that. I want to ask you about something maybe even more frightening than murder, which is dating. And by that, I mean, it seems to me, and we were talking about this earlier on, I was looking around social media, and all of a sudden, you mentioned like the axe throwing places where people are going for dates and having a good time, stuff like that. Yeah. Are you familiar with Thorin Bradley on TikTok at all?
Yes, I looked him up. Yeah, that was interesting.
The really handsome guy. Yeah, he's got the muscles and the tattoos, and he's got the suspenders, and he has frankly a very sexualized presence when he does the axe chopping stuff, and he knows what he's doing, right? So I'm wondering, are we seeing now the axe take on this weird might not be the new role in its ties to like masculinity and sexuality, like, and maybe I said it was worse than murder, but it's like in a more fun way. Is the axe taking on now that like people aren't having to go out and chop these and build these cities with an axe? Is it taking on this different thing, this nostalgic idea of manhood and dating and such? Like, what's going on with this?
Absolutely. So one thing I want to take it all the way back to the beginning and talk about sexy hand axe theory for just a second.
Sexy hand axe theory?
Which is a theory which is a theory that a couple of anthropologists came up with, that says that a great hand axe could be a good marker for a mate in prehistoric times. An axe shows that where resources are, that you can work with other people to get this napped, that you're going to actually finish this project and not just throw it away. So I think that there's, the ability to provide and the ability to survive and construct, shelter and defend yourself is, I think, always always a sexy thing to look for in a mate. I think one thing that's interesting about this rebound, though, is that we were just talking about battle axes. We were talking about battle axes. That's a very desexualized term. That's a very that's an old lady term. That's a term to kind of separate them and mark them as different from, young people. And it's interesting. It's kind of fallen out of favor now, maybe because of that. But I think that was a mark of industrialization, that the axe, which was so present and so relevant, in the 19th century, as we came to the end of the 19th century, all of its uses were being supplanted. There were so many things that we needed for axes that we didn't need anymore. We were heating our homes in a different way. We were getting our food in a different way. It was just becoming more, we were even chopping lumber in a different way. We had chainsaws by 1920. So I think that it kind of fell out of favor and became associated with stodginess. And with anything, there's a cycle. Once it loses that appeal, it becomes ripe for reinvention. And I think the further and further we get from using the axe on a daily basis and using it really as an essential tool for survival, it gains a novelty. And I think that as we become more disconnected from the things that keep us alive, the more we use devices and screens for everything, for all, sustenance, for repairs, for everything, entertainment, the more relevant the axe becomes as a way of showing that you're not just living on a screen, that you're not just someone who can't do anything for themselves once you take them out from behind a computer. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting that it's axes late. I do think you're right. I do think it is about axes lately and not swords, because I think swords have gotten a little bit of a mall ninja, I guess I would say. They've gotten kind of
cheap.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of, what do I want to say? An axe is something that you use. And I think it is interesting that it's in, that it's like mostly focused on wood cutting. It's mostly focused on chopping down trees, another phallic symbol there. And I think that it's the fact that it's focused on productivity and not defense. It's not about throwing axes and being in competition or like having a battle. It's not really about defense. It's about productivity. It's about what I can do with my own two hands. So I do think that there's something there.
Yeah, I should probably tell you that my childhood best friend, I'm actually wearing the watch that I got as a groomsman for the wedding. But the other the other gift we received the groomsmen at the wedding were tomahawks.
Really?
All the fellas. Absolutely. This bunch of guys grew up in Western Kentucky.
Hey,
so
there's a sign of, what is it? Diplomacy right there, friendship making. Yeah.
Or infinite childhood is probably something along those lines. All right, let me ask you this, Rachel, as we're wrapping up here. Pardon the pun. You know what? Don't pardon the pun. I absolutely meant this when I sent this to you earlier, but every book has stuff that gets left on the chopping block. So look back on the book. Were the things in here that you're like, oh man, I wish I could have done this, or that you're saving for the next project? Like, are there other stories here that you wanted to tell?
No, I'm off axe murder for a little while. I've been working on. I started The Man from the Train in 2012, so this has been 13 years of focusing on the axe in one way or the other. So I don't think that my next book I'm looking at is still gonna be true crime, but I think a little bit less bloody. So yeah, there were definitely there were so many little side trips that I had to end up cutting. I had a whole thing about tomb robbing in China that I really got into, like 6 pages about tomb robbing that I had to eventually cut. I had to cut a chapter. Probably the worst one was the chapter about Thomas Jefferson's nephews. This is a really awful story. Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, he had these two nephews that were just awful. Thomas Jefferson's family was inbred as hell. They kept marrying cousins until it was a problem. And his sister married one of their cousins several times over and had several kids that were not functioning. So, and
King
at
Charles
the beginning
level of stuff. Go on.
What's that?
This is a King Charles level of inbred, but go on.
Yeah. Worse, I'd say. So at the beginning of the United States, they were in pretty high status. They were in Charlottesville. They were part of the elite families in the area. But they overfarmed their land, kept planting tobacco over and over and over again until the land was exhausted. And they basically kept piling up debts. They were big drinkers. They were, constantly offending people. And so eventually they went to the frontier, which at the time was Kentucky. Daniel Boone was a popular figure. And this is right smack dab in the middle of Jefferson's presidency. So even though it's kind of adding to the shame, your brother-in-law is the president, and yet you're asking me for a loan until next Friday. Does not look good. So they went to Kentucky, and they were able to kind of restart their plantation, fine living again, on the backs of their enslaved people, of which they had quite a few. Not because it was productive for them. There were a lot of people who owned slaves a lot of people who enslaved people who were just doing it basically for the status of being a slave owner.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really profitable to them. It was actually a drag on their finances, but they couldn't, give up that status of owning other people. And that was definitely the case for Lucy Jefferson's family, the Lewises. And so they came out to Kentucky, and they're still failing. They're still racking up debts. Then they start dying. A lot of deaths. Lucy dies, and that's a big loss of status for them because she was a great lady from a great family, et cetera, et cetera. And so they had this 17-year-old boy that they enslaved named George. I don't know a ton about George. I believe he came from Virginia with them. And George is sent to get water at a local spring, and he takes Lucy's Wedgwood pitcher, which was a really high status plaster pitcher, kind of one of the symbols of their fine former life. And he trips and breaks the pitcher. And this sends her two sons, Isham and Lilburn, into a rage. They restrain George, and they terrorize all of the enslaved people they still held in the kitchen, ranting and raving the whole night while dismembering George. Really, really awful scene. Oh, train. Sorry. It's a little... one of the little repair cars. Sorry. So they hold George. They're ranting and raving the whole night, terrorizing their enslaved people. And in the morning, there is a huge earthquake. Starts in Kentucky, not an usual thing. That's not earthquake country. And it lasts for 2 months. The ground basically does not stop moving for 2 months. And in their attempt to conceal George's body, the earthquake unearths it basically, and his skull is found and brought back to town. And Isham and Lilburn are actually brought up on charges, which is interesting because, as you might expect, slaveholders were given a lot of enslavers were given a lot of leeway in doing what they wanted, basically. But these were not popular people, and the laws around slavery were changing at the time, even. So they were they were charged with these crimes. Isham, they planned a suicide pact. While they're planning the suicide pact, one of them shoots himself, so that's taken care of there. And then the other one runs off to join the army and is never heard from again. So very sad story, kind of displays it's so long and complicated. And it's not as central to the acts. It just comes up. It's interesting that it's a kitchen implement to me. But other than that, it's not really central to the story the way it is with, Tonnacresson and Washington and William Tillman in the chapter after that. And that's a much more, righteous story where a man who's, sailing is captured by Confederate pirates, and he fights back with the axe, kills his captors, and is able to sail the ship back to the north and get some of the rewards from that. So it's a really uplifting story, and it's kind of nice to have one not axe murderer, but one person who uses the axe in a way that you can really root for. And that's William Tillman. So we decided to cut that Jefferson chapter because of that. It's a fascinating story. Jefferson's Nephews is a good book. You can look it up to get basically the complete story on it. But yeah, I was disappointed. I did a lot of in-person research. I actually went to Kentucky, went to the University of Kentucky archives, and spent a couple days looking through all of his notes. The author of this book went to the site, and it's a very moving story, very poignant in how awful, in showing the reality of how awful slavery was. So I really enjoyed writing that, but I think it was the right choice to cut it eventually.
Well, Rachel, we've been talking now about this book and these stories for like an hour and a half, and there were so many more inside of this book that we didn't even talk about today.
I have a little more time if you want to talk about movies, movie aspect.
Yeah. Actually, so you talked a little bit about that, but like we see it come up in American Psycho, we see Thor.
Yeah.
Like where does the axe fit into these films?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think with American Psycho, he uses a lot of different methods of murder. He has a knife. He's got a chainsaw.
Right.
Chainsaw is an interesting one too. Yeah. You always think it's got that visual appeal. I think it's partially because it's so sharp and shiny.
Yeah.
Kind of just goes with his overall visage. Well, it is interesting, and I think the fact that he chooses that and not a sword or something like that is kind of a message about his brutality, and the fact that he's not doing this out of honor, I suppose. But then there's also the visual appeal of the chainsaw, which is not a very common murder weapon, by the way, compared to the axe. You don't see it as an axe. It's a lot of work. It's very hard to hold. The axe can be difficult to hold. It's easy to miss chop and hit your toe instead. But yeah, the chainsaw is not a very common actual murder weapon compared to the axe. But really, I mean, when we talk about the axe in pop culture, it really comes back to The Shining. I think it's all about The Shining and the impact that movie has left on popular culture, and the way that just that one scene has. I saw Sinners this weekend, and there's that great scene where it has the same shot of Kubrick, same Kubrick shot where he's trying to get out of the ice box. And then also the character sticks a knife through the door, kind of like Nicholson stuck an axe through the door. And I think it's interesting because, it's very much about the hotel in that choice. It's very much about, the axe is a fire safety tool in a lot of ways. And Jack Torrance in The Shining is trying to save the hotel. That's really his whole modus operandi there, is him trying to save the hotel from fire or other threats, of course, his wife and child. So I think that's a big part of what that axe is about. And I think just the way that it's used effectively, so visually, is really effective. And I do think it is about the phrase axe murderer, and it's because that's where it comes from. It's the Stephen King book, is that he doesn't actually use an axe in Jack Torrance doesn't use an axe in the Stephen King book, but Grady is established right away as an axe murderer, and they do use that phrase several times. So I do think that's where it comes from, as well as just the visual appeal of the axe. It's much shinier and much more cinematic than a mallet is, I think.
Has Thor redeemed the axe with Stormbreaker? Because I thought about that as like, oh wait, he gets a handle in the film.
That's interesting, and it's interesting because Thor's usually uses a hammer, right?
Mjolnir, traditionally,
Mjolnir, yes, that's interesting too to me, because that's also it's more of a tool than it is a weapon, also. So it's interesting. With Thor, it's really about the thunder aspect, right? That's across a bunch of different belief systems. The thunder and the axe are very often linked. I think in Mayan spirituality as well. I think it's in Greek and Roman mythology. And I think it's about the clang of the metal and the chop of the wood, and the sound of a tree falling is so much like thunder. So I think it's about that. And I think it's fun to see it exaggerated to such proportions. I think it's also about like video games a little bit, because, in video games, axes are often, they don't usually have just normal axe. Like, what Fred Strobel uses is a pretty small axe. Just to show you one, sorry. So this is like a normal axe. It's pretty light. This is not the kind of axe that you would see in a video game, basically. A video game axe is going to have that huge, huge blade and a relatively short handle. That's always interesting to me, because that would be really overbalanced. And I think that's a big part of what the Thor axe is about. Not just the Viking mythology, but also our expectation of seeing a huge axe. And it was also in the one of the Godzilla versus Kong movies recently. Kong's got a big old flint hand axe with not a hand axe, flint axe with a big handle as well. It's interesting.
Have you seen The Old Guard with Charlize Theron?
Yes, yeah, I
She
really
cares.
like that.
You were mentioning earlier, the very
Yeah,
feminization of that axe, right? You said the
yeah,
double,
absolutely.
you know?
Absolutely. There's Elabris. She's kind of an Amazon, so I think it goes back to that. But it's also, she's even more ancient than that. Kind of looks like the Egyptian crescent axes that I was talking about. Yeah. I really enjoyed that movie. I'm looking forward to the next one.
I know it's coming out in July, I think, on Netflix. I am ready for that. So,
but there's also the Triple X films as well. There's I haven't actually seen those yet, but I do know all about how Mia Goth uses an axe in those, and I think that's interesting because I think the first one is set in the 1910s during World War II, which is really a high point for axe murder, especially in newspapers and whatnot. That's when the axe murderer was being established as a newspaper catchphrase, kind of.
Wow. Again, it wasn't anything I was thinking about, and then I opened up the book. It's like, and then all of a sudden, it just became everywhere as I started to look around over the last little while I was reading this book. Rachel, this is a fun, cool
Thank
read.
You so much.
Dug it. This is so much fun.
I'm very proud of it.
It drops tomorrow. We're recording this on May 12th, so this is dropping on Tuesday, May 13th, which is how numbers work. Cool. So we'll be available as soon as people are listening. So they should go get this. This is really cool.
Much, Jason. I really
Rachel,
appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here.
Questions. I hope I wasn't too stutter step. I'm sure you're either.
I had so much fun asking you questions.
That goes back quite a ways. I found 1800 newspapers that refer to axing a question.
Oh, just like the axe, my puns have no end. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jason. Have a good day.
Yeah.